So, welcome everybody. This is the App Architecture Q&A number 5, and you will notice there's an empty chair next to me, and that's because Chris got sick yesterday and is not feeling well today. So, but luckily I have Matt here with me.
Yep, I'm still here every week.
Awesome. So today we have a bunch of questions lined up again, a few more than last week. So let's get into it. The first one is from Al on Twitter, and he asks, what are your thoughts regarding separating the different layers into frameworks to enforce the chosen architecture? Matt, do you want to give it a go?
You could separate all your layers out into frameworks, but I don't think it's the right approach. Generally, the reasons for separating things into a framework are because different people in your project are working on them, because you want to test your framework separately to the app, because you need to reuse code between projects. I like separating all of my domain logic out into its own framework. So the models, and if you're using view models, then view models, I like putting those into a separate framework because those are things you want to test against. I like putting reusable views into their own framework as well, especially because if you're using extensions on iOS, you can reuse the same views in your extensions that you're using in the app. So, I mean, this does create a situation where your views could be in one framework and your model could be in another framework, but I'm not coming at those decisions from the point of view of necessarily having them in separate layers. There's a sort of a pragmatic reason outside of layers to do it. So, yeah, you can end up in that situation, but I think it's better to have a nicer reason to separate into frameworks.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I think the layer boundary that where you would most often see a separation into frameworks would be between the model and the rest, right? I've seen something like this also if different people are developing the model framework than the rest of the app, or if the model framework is shared across Mac and iOS or something like that. But the rest is probably not so much along the layer boundary, but more view components, for example, that you are reusing or things like that. So awesome. That's the first question. Let's move on to the second one. The second one is from Paul, and he has two questions. The first one is a short one. Can you do MVVM without RX? Well, actually, in the MVVM chapter that we've released last week, there's a section in there that talks about exactly that. So how this would look like if you implement the internals of a view model without using RX or any kind of reactive framework, and how this whole thing would look like if you implement it entirely without RX. And so we are describing this in this chapter, and there's also, well, actually, I'm not 100% sure about this. I have to check it, but there should be sample code up that also contains these two variants. So you can check this out. Matt, do you have any other thoughts on this topic?
Well, as is sort of demonstrated in the code in the MVVM chapter, when you take RX away entirely, both internally and externally from the view model, you end up with a pattern that's closer to what's normally called model view presenter. It's a lot like MVC, model view controller, but with most of the presentation logic lifted up out of the controller into a separate type. And that only then references the controller through a protocol. It really has a profound effect on the entire approach, though, when you introduce a data flow pipeline like RX. I don't personally see a huge benefit to using MVP on its own. I know some people like it just because they want to do interface testing on the presenter, but there's still a lot of logic in getting the presenter to talk to the controller, so I always feel like there's a bit of extra work there that doesn't always need to be. But, the book's about choosing your own preference. So the work is there. You can have a look at the variations on it and make your own decisions.
Yeah, I found this interesting actually to refactor this backwards, so to say. So starting with the MVVM implementation, including RX, and then removing RX, and then it's really interesting how things get more and more similar to how the original view model gets more and more similar to the view controller as you would have it in MVC, and the difference only being that you are not talking to the UIKit components directly, but it resembles it a lot, I think. So yeah, but that's in the chapter and in the sample code, so you can look this up there. And the second question by Paul is, how do you do TDD with these architecture patterns? Matt, do you do TDD?
I do not. So I'm probably not a great authority to talk to about it. I, particularly for apps, so not including the model, not including a view model, or other kinds of structures in the domain layer, I find testing apps to be very difficult, unit testing apps, because you have to know how the view framework works intimately. And that kind of knowledge is very difficult to encode into your tests before you've started, because you'll get it wrong. You'll think that the table is going to work one way and your table view works a different way. And not only is your code wrong, but your tests are wrong too, because you've tested the wrong thing. And you also end up with a situation where your tests are really just recreating all of the work that the code does. You don't have this nice, clean, here's a parameter, check an output. You have rebuild exactly what the code does and just check that that they both are in sync. It's not particularly productive in many ways. So I do sometimes write tests second. I definitely the purpose of things like presenters or view models or absolutely your domain, the model itself, is to write tests on all of that. But it's a lot harder to write productive tests against controllers and delegates and table views. So when I do that, I tend to do it test second.
Yeah. So personally, I also I've never been a big fan of pure TDD really, and so I can't say much about this question, but I have two remarks. The first is we have actually done a public Swift Talk episode. Let me look it up. That is called Test-Driven Reactive Programming. So we recorded this with Lisa, who was working at Kickstarter at the time, and they had a MVVM code base with reactive. I'm not sure which reactive framework they used. And there's an episode with her about how they do test-driven development in this environment. So that's something you can look up. And the other thing I would say is, for example, an implementation like the Elm variant, the Elm architecture variant that we have of this example app, since we control the whole Elm framework as well, I think there it becomes more feasible to do something test-driven because you have the whole thing under control and you're not testing against UIKit. And so writing your tests first, I think is easier there than if you would test against UIKit views, because there's just much more things that happen that you don't anticipate upfront. So that's what I would add to this question. And now I have to find my way back here through my tabs. Yeah, here we are. So the next question is from Scott in the GitHub discussion threads, and he was talking about it's already quite a long thread, so I will try to summarize the gist of it. He was talking about how to deal with massive views, and then he also pasted in a screenshot of an app as an example that does a lot of drawing. So you have all kinds of parameters, and then you get some drawings, some drawing up representing a lens and light rays and vectors and all these kind of things, and a lot of equations on the screen. So there's a lot of drawing going on. And the question was basically how to deal with that. How can you avoid massive views, basically? And so the first thing I would say there is that if I look at this screenshot, if you have a diagram like that, then I think you can factor out a lot of code there into separate components. So, for example, if you draw this lens, and maybe you draw a coordinate system, and you draw fancy vector arrows and stuff like that, you can factor all this out into different components. And so this could be different views, but it could also just be the drawing code for these things extracted out into functions even. And I think the other thing is that all this code, this drawing code, should be not stateful. So you're just taking a bunch of values and you do the drawing for this data that has been handed to your views. So in this sense, it's a very different problem than architecting a whole app, which is inherently about managing state. Matt, do you have any advice how to refactor something like this sensibly?
Well, graphics rendering pipelines are a huge topic on their own. You need to decide, if you were to have it in an app, your model is going to emit some abstract data, and then your view layer is going to need to turn that abstract data into something like core graphics calls. And yeah, there's a lot of work in trying to decide what primitives you're going to draw, what collections of primitives are going to be reusable elements in your app, what groups and layouts and structures you're going to have within that. It all ends up breaking down. But yeah, it is a purely functional rendering pipeline. So there's no state. You're just processing the data that comes in, and you're using a series of abstracted calls to turn it into drawing commands. Yes, it can be very big. No, there's not going to be any app architecture solutions that make it smaller. It's really just a matter of choosing the right abstractions for your collections of drawing commands that make the work you're doing on a case-by-case basis simpler and smaller.
Yeah, I think that sums it up well. So we have a small meta question, so to say, in between. And that is Anders, I think. And he asks, will the videos of the book, so the videos going together with the book, also be available on SwiftTalk? And the answer is no, they won't. This is really a separate thing. That doesn't mean that we will do some SwiftTalk episodes here and there that lend ideas from the book. We have been working on this for a long time, and so naturally there will be a little bit of idea overlap, so to say. But the videos that go together with the book are really a separate thing, and they will not be duplicated in any way in SwiftTalk episodes. So that's that. And then the next question is from Cameron, and that's actually a follow-up comment to a question from a couple of weeks ago. And he asks, when you use an MVVM-C architecture, should you present alert views by the view controller? Should a view controller present alert views, or would this be a task that's better suited to go through the view model and maybe even to the coordinator? Matt, do you have an advice on that?
Well, the model adaptive viewbinder version of the app that we've written, because it deals with all of these interactions in a reactive pipeline, has had to solve this problem of modal alert views using reactive programming. And frankly, it's sort of the wrong solution for this kind of problem. Ultimately, the recordings app that we have has two modal alert views. The recording alert view that comes up and actually records the audio. And then when you dismiss that, up comes a text alert that says, name this recording. And when you're dealing with this in a reactive pipeline, you're just sort of saying, oh, here's an event in the reactive pipeline that describes a recording alert. Show the recording alert. Here's an event that describes the text alert. But you also have to deal with some nonsensical scenarios, like what happens if you've got the text alert up to name a recording, and then suddenly the next event down the pipeline is a recording alert. It makes sense in reactive programming that the events could come in that order, but it doesn't make sense in the app. And those are the sorts of problems you have to deal with if you're dealing with everything reactively. It can be done, but frankly, if you've got something like a coordinator in your app that is doing things imperatively, that's probably a simpler option in most cases. Christoph Zabłocki did comment on that question saying the coordinator should present alerts, and I agree with him. It's a better solution to have some kind of external manager that's managing the actual state there.
Yeah, I think it really, as soon as your app gets a little bit more complex, I mean, if you have one alert view in one place and nothing can go wrong there ever, so what, right? It doesn't really matter. But yeah, I would agree with you that the coordinator is actually made for these kind of tasks, right? Coordinating the presentation of different view controllers and things alike. So that brings us to the last question for this week. And this one is, let's see, by Charles. And that is also a more recent comment on in an older thread in the GitHub discussions. And so the whole thread was about dealing with massive view controllers, a topic rarely talked about, right? So anyway, this follow-up comment is about the trade-offs in designing for reusability. So, or phrased differently, are there any benefits to having a massive view controller? And what do you lose maybe if you separate things out into multiple small components? So I think there are definitely trade-offs involved. One trade-off is that you put in more interfaces between things, and that's definitely, well, first of all, it's work, and it's some sort of mental overhead, I would say, as well. So you have to know how these interfaces work and how they play together, and you have to navigate through more components, more files, all these kind of things. So I think there are definitely trade-offs in there, just from this perspective. But I think another problem with designing for reusability is often that reusability is, as Charles already says in his question, it's often theoretical. And so as long as reusability is theoretical, it's not really clear how you should make the thing reusable, because there's no use case for it. And I always find this hard to do this upfront just for the sake of it, because I don't really know what needs to be configurable, for example, what doesn't, all these kind of questions. Matt, do you have further thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, simply on the topic of reusability, it's almost impossible to design a reusable component until you've got two places in your app that need to do the same thing. Because then you have actual requirements for what does this reusable component need to provide. If you try to design all of your components reusably up front, it probably won't work. You'll find that as soon as you need to use them in a second location, it's not quite doing what the second location needs. This is different if you've written basically the same app 3 or 4 times. You start to get a feel for what an app of a certain kind is going to need. But reusability is one of those things that's best done as a refactoring pass, I find. But in terms of, I mean, remember in a classic model view controller, the controller is not supposed to be reusable. The model might be reusable, the views are definitely reusable, But the controller is just the integration logic pulling the two together. And theoretically, that is done every single time. So you're not supposed to get reusability out of controllers. I know that might sound weird, but if you have logic that you think you can make reusable in your controller, it might not have, you probably shouldn't have had it in the controller to begin with. It was probably view logic, layout logic, model logic, fetching logic, sorting logic. These are things that don't really belong in your controller.
Yeah, and I would also say that it's an eternal question in some way, right? Like, what's the right level of abstraction, or how much should you break down your program? And even if you've been doing this for a long time, this question doesn't really go away. I think what you could say, well, don't do this prematurely, and I think that's sensible advice, but it's also not very concrete, because what is premature and what's not, right? So this is something you just have to develop some sort of a feeling for over time, I would say.
But in answering the question of, are there any benefits to a massive view controller, absent the problem
Yes.
of breaking it apart incorrectly, no. There's not really any benefit other than, saving the work of refactoring it. In general, view controllers become too big because you've put things in them that shouldn't be there. Most of the time, the biggest problem is you've got model and domain logic that is trapped in your view controller because you haven't really thought about your data pipeline. You've thought, I need to present this. I need to put things on screen. I need to think about my views and my buttons and my windows. But you haven't thought, what am I putting in these? How am I transforming that and getting it ready for the screen? And, how are my views going to respond to my data? So generally, massive view controller is because you've thought about your entire program wrong. It's the framework kind of telling you you've forgotten to pay attention to your data, and binding your data to your views has just gotten too hard.
Yeah. So my last thought on this topic is that I think I would almost never design for reusability, because reusability is just a proxy anyway for good design, whatever this might be. But I would more design for readability, for maintainability, for these kind of things. And also, of course, then the question, like, what is too big for a view controller? Well, nobody knows, right? You have to judge this for yourself, and then you might have coworkers who will judge this for you as well, and then you have to come to some sort of a consensus there. But I think there are just better things to design for than reusability if you don't need it really. So these are the questions. Matt, do you have any closing remarks?
On the questions in general?
Yeah, whatever.
We're still working hard on the last few chapters of the book. I've got a whole lot of testing code apparently to write, so that'll be fun. There's a possibility we might release a lot of testing code all in one go.
Yeah, this might happen. So testing sections are still outstanding or missing in a couple of chapters. And so in general, this week or just yesterday, we released the model view controller plus view state implementation, or not just the implementation, but also the first part of the chapter. Next week, we are probably going to release the first part of the Elm chapter. Not entirely sure about that yet. We will see how things go. And then we almost have at least a part of each chapter out. Model adapter view binder is missing, and the online-only MVC still is missing. But those will follow in the next weeks. So yeah, that's all from my side. Thanks for submitting all the questions. Keep them coming via GitHub issues, GitHub discussions, Twitter, email, whatever channel you prefer. We will do this again next week. maybe also on Tuesday because I'm traveling on Monday. But yeah, see you next week. Bye, Matt.
Bye.